I just want to begin by saying welcome to everybody. For those of you who are joining us online, my name is JP Gritton, and I teach fiction here in the English department at Duke. And it's just a huge pleasure to be introducing Matthew Buckley Smith, whose latest book of poems won the Richard Wilbur Prize. I want to say thanks, Matthew, for being here.
Of course.
As well as thanks to the Trinity College of Liberal Arts and Dean Martin Smith for their support in the form of an innovative course enhancement. And thanks as always to Quante, without whom none of these online events would be possible. So just a little bit about the course and kind of how you fit in. And so through readings, through assignments, through visits like this one, this Introduction to Creative Writing invites students to see themselves as part of a kind of ongoing tradition of storytellers, both by poets and prose writers. And a funny thing has happened as I've taught, and I found myself occasionally, the word is not disturbed, but curious about a hypothetical possibility, by this thought that sometimes troubles me. Just how easy it would be, for instance, to find some long ago, forgotten collection of short stories or a long forgotten collection of poems, take it off the rack at Perkins, change a few details, alter character names and place names, swap out the pretty description of a cherry tree and replace it with an elm tree, whatever, and submit the resulting story for credit. And it doesn't seem to happen. And I think it's about two things, and one of them is obvious, right? I've got like a good solid group of writers who love writing, and they're talented writers. There's no need to plagiarize in this way, but I think it's actually maybe about something murkier and weirder and harder to put your finger on. So say hypothetically, I had a student who picked an old volume of poetry off the shelf in Perkins, and say she found a poem of 14 lines, this hypothetical student's consisting of 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet, and say she made a few minor adjustments of detail, just enough to cover her tracks, and turned it in and received credit for it. Would you have committed plagiarism if you had done so, or would you have simply written a sonnet? And I think the answer is that you've just written a sonnet. Poets, maybe because they don't have to worry about the financial implications of plagiarism, are better acquainted than fiction writers with the truth at the heart of originality, which is that there is no such thing as originality. I'm always fascinated by poets like today's guest, Matthew Buckley Smith. That is, people who write...
Totally unoriginal.
Au contraire, monsieur. No, that is great poets who also write great fiction and great plays. Because I think their work is refreshingly honest about the fact that no writer writes in a vacuum. When I first met today's guest, Matthew Buckley Smith, his first book of poetry had not yet won the Able Muse Prize. His second book of poetry had not yet won the Richard Wilbur Award, and he had not yet become the host of a popular poetry podcast. As a lecturer at the Johns Hopkins University, Matthew wrote poetry almost exclusively, and sometimes, like a pitcher throwing sidearm, he wrote plays in verse. Matthew was that annoying person whose work you sometimes ended up hearing about secondhand, as in Matthew's new play is really good. As he sometimes did in his poetry, Matthew found inspiration for his dramas in the tradition itself, and feeling in the tradition itself. And I remember sitting in the audience of one of his productions, a drama in verse epilogue to an Aeschylus tragedy, and feeling kind of nauseous with envy. So as a poet, Matthew had long ago discovered something about stories that I had maybe always sensed but never quite allowed myself to accept, which is that true originality starts with embracing the fact that nothing is truly original. So I think it's fitting that over the weekend I graded a stack of stories and poems that invited you guys to write back to a story or a piece of writing that we'd encountered early in the semester. So some of you wrote back to Langston Hughes, whose I Too forms an answer to Whitman's I Hear America Singing. others wrote back to Mayakovsky, others wrote back to Dennis Johnson, and then others of you wrote covers of Ray Carver's What We Talk About When We Talk About Love. And in these sketches, I saw students using the blueprint of Carver's story to explore subjects as diverse as privilege, as fatherhood, as polyamory, as money. They were really amazing, and just a total delight to read. Those covers allowed for, I think, just a staggering variety of improvisation. It accommodated differences in style and tone and word choice and rhythm in addition to subject. And I think it is without a doubt the strongest fiction y'all have turned in this semester, and it was really, and the strongest fiction and poetry that y'all have turned in this semester. I think what it maybe suggests is that we're all kind of plagiarists of a sort, or else something like Plato, whose symposium formed the basis for Carver's story, and he claimed to have simply recorded the speeches of his illiterate mentor Socrates. In other words, wherever we go, it is there that we will be, or as Matthew puts it in his really amazing poem, Undergrads, the place we lived was only an idea, nothing to do with the failed cotton mill town, where a record shop, some bars, and a pizzeria were all we ever cared to call our own. From nightmares of a happy life with kids, we'd wake in boozy sweat to find the floor still cobbled with bottle caps and takeout lids, our 20s crumpled safely in a drawer. Unspent like all the hours ahead that night, we met each other in the common room and found somehow, without the help of light, our way across the river. By the time dawn spilled down from the campus to the banks, we'd come to, single, sobered up again, to see the morning glories give their thanks for things we had and hardly noticed then. So please join me in welcoming Matthew Buckley Smith.
Yeah. I wondered, is there anything to write with over here, or if not, that's okay. I don't have anything important to write. I was just going to say, because you reminded me, if you want a really delicious story about plagiarism, Ian McEwan has one called My Purple Scented Novel. It's really fun. I don't know if maybe you've taught it already, but it's
not in this class.
Yeah, it's a really fun one. I think it should be free online if you look it up. My Purple Scented Novel. So, y'all read the David Yazzie essay about poems being kind of like jokes? Yeah, I think it's a terrific essay. I really learned a lot from it. And I picked out some poems for y'all here. You may have had a chance to look at, may not. And not all of these is a perfect illustration of that principle, but I just thought they're kind of good poems to read, so I wanted mostly to give y'all something good to read. And for two, maybe we'll talk about one or two of them and sort of how they do what they do. So, my sister, I have a little sister and a littler brother. My sister, when she was still in high school and I was in college, she was maybe 16 or 17. My little brother was 11 or 12, it would have been 5 years difference. And they went with my dad to, back in the days of Blockbuster, they went to rent a video. I don't know if you all have any idea what this is, but they rented a movie at a physical location, they brought it home, and it was like a dumb teen comedy. And they were watching together, and there was this moment when my sister told me about this later, because it left a mark. There was this very specific joke or gag in the movie, and it had to do with the physical mechanics of having sex. Specifically, it was sort of a joke at the expense of straight men in bed. And sitting on the couch lined up, my brother, who was 11 or 12, nothing. No response. My dad laughed. My sister really laughed. At which point, my dad stopped laughing and looked at my sister. My sister stopped laughing and looked at the floor. So my question for you is, why did my dad stop laughing? You all laughed, so presumably you understand why, yeah.
Because he realized that your sister had some point of reference for what was actually happening in her own life.
Right. You don't get a joke unless you recognize something. Right? That tends to be kind of the intersection of a joke. You know, the punchline of joke tends to coincide surprise with recognition. Right? I think part of what is thus, I think, true about jokes, and it's easier to see this about jokes. I think part of what I really like about Yazzie's essay is that a lot of things he says about poetry are not necessarily things you have to learn through the lens of jokes. Like there are, I think he does in a very analytical and responsible way, he sort of lines up some of the devices and the structural similarities, and that's really useful, and I hope you take a close look at all those. But I think a lot of what he's saying are just things that are true about poems, but they are easier to see in the context of jokes, and they're a little more inarguable in the context of jokes, right? As he says, when you go to a comedy club, you don't need to have a discussion at a coffee house later about whether or not it was successful. You can tell right there if it was successful, because people laugh, or they don't. And I think given that jokes clearly have so much to do with recognition, you have to get a joke. In order to get it, you have to already have something, and that thing is kind of, I think when Freud talks about humor, he talks about this thing that's sort of already in you, and the joke, or the comedy, or whatever it is, doesn't so much give you a new thing, as it does catalyze, or trigger this thing that's inside you, in a way that is enjoyable and also sometimes a little bit uncomfortable. So I think part of what is true about jokes, and I think it's really true about poetry, that maybe is a little less obvious about poetry, and I don't know, I can't remember how much Yazzie talks about this specifically in the essay, because I haven't read it for a couple months, but is that the news that you get from a joke, the news that you get from a poem, for the most part, anything you say about a poem is not universally true, there's always some exception, but for the most part, it's not news, it's old news. Very seldom is a poem really purely giving you something completely new. Sometimes what it'll do is give you something partly new and make it clear how that is like something you already recognize. But very seldom does it completely deliver some brand new message to you, which is, I think, I have found that helpful as a thought in reading poetry and teaching poetry and just talking about poetry, because I think one of the big challenges that a lot of people have when they read poetry, I certainly had as a kid, I found miserable in a lot of the poetry classes I took as a kid, is agonizing over what that, can I swear in this podcast? I guess I should swear on Facebook, but
No.
I'm used to I swear a lot in my, the Irish Catholic family. But what the fuck does it mean? What does it mean? Right, that's the thing, that's what's deadly. Right, and I think JP and I were talking about this, certainly in classes we've taught elsewhere, in our own experience with the classes, it's very common to go online and to find some website or some paper, something that just tells you what it means so you can get some kind of answer. Even if you then digest that, even if you massage it a little bit, you work it over, you're just trying to find something to tell you what's on the other side of this, what is it getting at? And I don't know if it will be helpful or just really frustrating to tell you that I think almost not at all about what poems mean. As I write them, as I read them, I think very, very little about what they mean, except maybe at a very mechanical sentence by sentence level. Right, because as you know by this point, because simply by having tried to write anything, papers, fiction, poems, you know that it's really hard to write a clear sentence. Just a clear sentence, especially a short sentence. There's the old joke Mark Twain wrote to a friend. He wrote, I wrote you a long letter because I didn't have time to write you a short one. Right, so writing just a clear sentence is the hardest thing in the world, and writing a short sentence or a short line that is clear, that's incredibly difficult. So, on the level of the line, on the level of the sentence, I think clarity, meaning, is important just so that you can communicate it all. But in terms of some larger, grander message or meaning, I wouldn't say that those don't exist. I wouldn't say that other people don't care a lot about them. I know they do. I'm just saying I don't think a whole lot about them. And it's not because I don't think about what's going on in a poem. When I read a poem, I tend to ask two questions. What does it do? What does it do? Now, what does it mean? What does it do? And how does it do it? That is, does it make me feel anything? If it doesn't make me feel anything, do I need to read it again? Is there something I don't know that I need to, anytime you read anything in any language, you have to have some context, right? It's not enough to know just the pure denotation of the words. You have to have some sense of, for example, what sex is like. or what a place is like, or sometimes what a time was like. So you need some context at times. But if I have a reasonable amount of context, and I read a poem, and I think I understand it on a line-by-line, sentence-by-sentence level, and it doesn't make me feel anything, I don't really see any point in reading it again. Now, you are in a class and you have assignments and you should listen to JP. So that's not a get out of jail free pass. But I think what maybe can be fun, or at least what I sometimes find fun, is letting go of some grander purpose and just thinking about the experience of the poem. The same way that I think we experience jokes, right? You certainly know, you may not be a stand-up comics, you may not know how to deliver a joke in some great way, but you do know how to ruin a joke, yeah? You've all had jokes ruined, you've probably done it yourself. You found, oh no, I forgot to tell you this other thing that you needed to hear earlier for this to be funny, right? Or you slightly mess up the phrasing of the punchline, right? Or, worst of all, you then explain a joke that didn't land. So we know how to mess up a joke, but I think what that suggests is that there is a way to deliver it well. And that what this really has to do with is giving you a certain piece of information, a certain sound, a certain rhythm, a silence, a pause, whatever it is, a series of little stimuli in a certain order, at a certain pace, in order to provoke laughter. Poetry is less simple than that, not because comedy is simple, but because comedy tends to have generally one goal, right, which is laughter. And poetry's goals are a little mushier at times. Unlike comedy, or unlike stand-up comedy, in poetry on the page, you don't have the advantage of a delivery, right? Though spoken word poetry, which is increasingly and taken seriously, is all about the delivery, right? And really, the spoken word poetry on the page, y'all, I'm assuming, just to refer to the most prominent example of poetry that's, I think, very much in the spoken word tradition, y'all have heard, seen the footage of Amanda Gorman's poem for the Inauguration? Yeah. Have you read it on the page? Some of you may have. It's not great on the page. It's very impressive in the recording, right? She's impressive, her delivery is fantastic. It's a performance as much as it's anything, and that's, I think, very much like stand-up. But on the page, there's at least a tradition of poetry that lives on the page, and here you have to find other ways to control the delivery of the ingredients. So just maybe to talk about one of these, and you shout at me when I need to stop. I don't know where I'm at as far as time or.
We can play. I also thought, you're a poet, and I did. If we have some questions too, just in terms of process and stuff. But that can come much later. So
yeah, I'll just quickly walk through one of these. I think is maybe fairly digestible in a straightforward way. So this is a gift by Don Patterson. So this is maybe in the middle of your pack, or it's somewhere in the middle. I can't find it. A few in. This is a real short one. A gift by Don Patterson. I'll just read it once straight through. A gift. That night she called his name, not mine, and could not call it back. I shamed myself and thought of that blind girl in Kodiak, who sat out on the stoop each night to watch the daylight fade and lift her child down to the gate cut in the palisade. And what old caution love resigned when through that misty stare she passed the boy, not her bare-skinned husband, but the bear. So this is a relatively simple poem, right? It sets up a parallel. The very beginning, there's a whole story told just in the first two lines, right? That night she called his name, not mine, and could not call it back. What are we talking about?
Is there like a relationship going on here?
Yeah, so there are, I think, there aren't a lot of contexts in which this would be worth noting, right? If you're bothering to say it, it's probably because it matters to say. And so maybe there are other contexts in which you would say the wrong name, right? Sure, there are plenty. I call my daughter our dog's name constantly. Right? They're similar names, same number of syllables. But you wouldn't write a poem about that. Or maybe she will 20 years from now. But there is at least one context in which you definitely would take note, yeah?
They're like having sex and she says someone else's name.
Yeah. Right. The suggestion here, right, when that happens, the reason that's a big deal is that the wrong person's on her mind, right? Presumably, her, this moment of desire, of passion, right? The expression in vino veritas, in vino veritas, what does it mean?
In wine truth.
Yeah. When people are drunk, they say what they really mean, right? Not always exactly true, but there's truth to that, right? And similarly, in a moment of naked passion, presumably, what's really on your mind, what you really feel, comes out. And that's why it's especially painful. She called his name, not mine, and could not call it back. You can't unsay that. Doesn't matter how many times you say Don Patterson's name after that, the one leaves a mark. And he moves from there immediately to this other story. So I shamed myself and thought of that blind girl in Kodiak. So he does a lot here in very few words. Right? He tells us the story of the first 2.5 lines. We receive, and it's almost all. Is it all? Yeah, that first stanza, except for Kodiak, is all monosyllables. There's not, he doesn't get fancy. He doesn't get, Hemingway said something to the effect of, never use a $10 word when a 5-cent word will do. I shamed myself and thought of that blind girl in Kodiak. So he takes us to a place, that blind girl in Kodiak. He sets up a story with just these few words. That is a choice, right? He could have said, I thought of a blind girl in Kodiak. But he says, that blind girl in Kodiak. Suggesting, he may just have made this up, I don't know. But by saying that, he's suggesting, oh, you know the story. He's recruiting us into this existing story. He says, of course I'm referring to something you already know. He brings us in. That blind girl in Kodiak. We'll come back to blind later. And then Kodiak, I think, is a nice choice. This is a poem that rhymes loosely A-B-A-B. You could just call it A-B-X-B. Mine, blind, night cut, resigned, bare-skinned. Those are slant rhymes of different varieties. But he certainly rhymes back, Kodiak, fade, palisade, stare, bear. And the first time reading this poem that we hear a really strong, crisp, true rhyme, Kodiak, is a proper noun, right? It's a proper noun, it's a 3-syllable noun too. So I think part of what is nice there is that it makes it feel inevitable, right? If you reverse the order of those rhymes, if you put Kodiak in the second line position and you end with back, the impression we're going to get is, oh, he had to say Kodiak because that's a proper noun. Presumably this is the place. And then he was struggling to find something to rhyme with it. Whereas if you put Kodiak last, it feels like it just came out that way. It was just effortless. Yeats says, a line may take us hours maybe, but if it does not seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching has been naught. You work hard to make it look easy. I shamed myself and thought of that blind girl in Kodiak who sat out on the stoop each night to watch the daylight fade. He did something right there. Blind girl who watched the daylight fade. What did he just tell you? She's not completely blind. You can see light. There's a little bit. See something. Right? That's a really difficult piece of information to convey. He had some idea. My guess is he came up with the first 2 lines and he said, boy, that sounds good. And he had this other story in mind. And he had to communicate, she's blind, but she's not totally blind. It's sort of like Isaac in the Bible, but it's how do you say that? How do you get that across? He keeps it simple. She's blind. And then he gives you another piece of information. She can see a little. He doesn't spend several lines saying when she looked through her eyes that she had cataracts and so it was sort of like snow. He just says she was blind and he takes it back a little bit. Who sat out on the stoop each night to watch the daylight fade and lift her child down to the gate cut in the palisade. Palisade is maybe the one word in this poem that I think is a little, I feel like the form is guiding the poem a little bit, but as with Kodiak, he nicely ends the rhyme. He closes the rhyme with the 3-syllable word, right? Which as with a proper noun, makes it feel more inevitable. Makes it feel like, oh, it just landed this way. But he gives us a routine for her. And what old caution love resigned, when through that misty stare, there, I think he does something really nice. That misty stare gives us an image for what her blindness is actually like. There's also, when we refer to the eyes as misty, have you ever heard someone refer to your eyes as misty-eyed? Yeah, what does that tend to mean?
Crying.
Crying, maybe not crying fully, you know, not like rainy-eyed, you know, misty-eyed. On the verge of tears, a little sentimental, nostalgic. I was watching a movie, maybe a little misty-eyed. There's something sentimental about that. Because who are we talking about to begin with? Well, where did this one begin? Begin with his girlfriend or his wife, who said the wrong guy's name. Right? Presumably because she had some sentimental attachment. So he creates this little echo for us, to make it feel true. He's making a comparison. Part of what he's doing is he's selling a comparison to us. He's trying to sell it by comparing the blindness of the blind girl, the mistiness, misty vision of the blind girl, with the sentimentality of the wife. That's not because that's a secret meaning of the poem, that's a trick. Because you could easily say, this comparison does not stand. He's selling it. And what old caution love resigned, when through that misty stare she passed the boy to not her bare-skinned husband, but the bear. That's a terrible story. That's fucking terrible. It also is a little bit, I would say, self-serving. So what's the story with the blind girl and the bear? That's heartbreaking. What happened there? What happened when she gave the, yeah.
It was like an accident. I really like the word, or the line, and what old caution loved resign. Like the old caution, she maybe used to be a little bit more careful about who she's handing her baby to, but now she let something slip, or I don't know, maybe their marriage was getting a bit stale too, and she let it slip in the same way.
You're right, what old caution love resigned. That line on its own could apply to either story, right? It's flexible, yeah? No, so you're quite right there. It's another way he is getting us to buy in to this comparison. What happened with this blind girl is that she went down every day down to the edge of the gate in the city, or in the little town, and she handed her baby off to her husband who was wearing a bearskin, right? Again, information he delivers very succinctly. He doesn't spend a lot of time setting this up for us. He sets us up only with the information we need ahead of time. She does this every day. She's blind, or she can see a little bit. And so one day, she saw a bear. And she made a mistake. In this case, it's both more and less serious than what his wife did, right? It's less serious because it's completely inadvertent, and it's a totally honest mistake. It's a totally innocent mistake. She wasn't distracted. She was thinking this was her husband, and it wasn't. The other thing that happens, of course, is that it is absolutely terminal. You can't get it back. So there's the suggestion here, if we follow the analogy, that she didn't really mean it. She didn't really mean it. But also, that's permanent. I'm never going to get over this. I'm never quite going to forgive her for this. So I think it gives us this feeling at the end that really recruits us onto his side of this exchange. It gives us this satisfying feeling because there is this sense that these two stories line up nicely, partly because he makes them line up nicely. That's, by the way, another trick of rhyme, is that when something rhymes, especially if it rhymes elegantly, if it rhymes in an effortless seeming way, it feels true. Right? You were too young to, you weren't even alive during the O.J. Simpson trial. But there's only one sentence that everybody from that trial remembers verbatim. If the glove don't quit, you must have, if the glove don't fit, you must have quit. Right? Rhyme makes things feel true. It makes things land. It sticks with us. Right? So again, I know JP said that some of y'all have been experimenting with form. Great, good. It's hard. It's really hard. And you know you're doing it well when other people think it looks easy. But it's a tool, right? All of these devices you learn about in poetry classes as a kid, all of these poetic techniques that you memorize vocabulary, all of these are tools to produce an effect. And often it's to sell something to your reader. It's to get your reader to buy into something. It's to make something feel true, whether it is or not. I don't know if this is a fair comparison. Boy, when you read the poem, it feels fair. It feels right. I would say another poem, we don't need to break this down a lot. I know you all read another poem by Robert Hayden.
Could I ask
Yeah, please.
I mean, you said some stuff about Ryan that
Yeah.
is just so of interest to me, and I, you pick on Kodiak as it's this proper noun it's both kind of, it has this feeling of a thing that is both unexpected and somehow inevitable.
Yeah.
Like it has the feeling of, it just happens to be. It just so happens that everything I'm writing is perfectly rhyming.
Oh, yeah. And one other thing I forgot about Kodiak, that I know nothing about Kodiak, the place. There's only one thing I know about Kodiak, the place. There are bears there.
Mm.
So he's loading a gun with that line.
Mm.
Because if he's gonna pull the trigger later, it needs to be ready to go. And so it's a little seed he plants. It's not his hidden meaning, it's a tool. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, so to some extent, you're kind of anticipating what I was going to say, which is that this idea that the Palisade, that's you said, I forget exactly how you said something about the form kind of guiding the poem. You're feeling
It's my intuition there. I don't know. I could.
Well, no, but would you just say a bit more about what you mean, or even as folks who are kind of dipping our toes in the formal waters, like, I mean, how do you train your ear to, because it's easy to cheat, right? I mean, it's easy to rhyme cat and bat and blue and shoe.
Well, and it's only cheating if you don't get away with it in poetry, I would say. Oh, no, totally. I mean, rules of thumb for getting away with it, right? Not for following. There are no gods of poetry. When we talk about the rules of poetry, it's not that there are no rules, right? People who say, oh, there are no rules, you do whatever you want, man. Well, you can do whatever you want, it just will likely be a piece of shit. But there are no gods who are going to punish you for breaking the rules. The rules have to do with getting something out of your audience, producing an effect. Again, you could break the rules if you can get away with it. But yes, some rules of thumb for rhyme would be, don't use a word in a rhyme you would not use on a non-rhyme, right? If you're writing a poem, and you use a word that you would only ever use for a rhyme, that's what it's going to sound like. Yeah? If you are rhyming two words, and one of those words is a lot less common than the other one, start with the less common one. Right? Actually, I'm sorry, I said it the wrong way around. End with the less common one. Yeah, I was totally wrong. End with the less common one. Because if you start with the less common one, as I said with Kodiak, we're going to read that, we're going to say, oh, how's he going to rhyme that? And then we're going to see him struggling to make it work. Whereas if he ends with this line, this word you would not have come up with, there's a risk there, right? The risk being you're only using this because of the rhyme, and that's the risk here, I think, with Palisade. He rhymes fade with Palisade. He's trying to get to this place. Palisade is a word that I think in the vocabulary of this poem probably doesn't appear unless it's in a rhyme position. But it's pretty good, and it's pretty efficient, so I can't really fault him for it. It's just my radar flickers a little bit when I read that.
What does it mean?
I'm sorry?
What does Palisade mean?
Do you know the expression beyond the pale?
No.
You never heard beyond the pale? Oh, wow. The rest of y'all heard?
I've never heard that.
Wow, okay.
Isn't it like beyond what is like considered okay or normal?
Yeah, it's a figure of speech. Which is true for almost all language. Almost all language is actually a metaphor. So a palisade is like a big fence, basically. A pale, the pale. When you say beyond the pale, you know what like a picket fence, like a old little cute fence. Each of those flat stakes is a pale. So beyond the pale is outside the city walls. Because it used to be when you had city walls, it was not just to decorate your property. It was because there's bandits out there, right, or bears. So that's what there's a gate cut in this big fence, protecting their little living area, whether it's a town or it's their little property, we don't know. Ryan told me, a friend of mine who's a reader, told me that hubris comes from the name of the little barrier islands outside of Greece, that there were these, to hubris, the name of those islands was derived from the same word as hubris, or hubris was derived from their name, and so hubris was actually to go beyond those, right? You're going way out. If you're beyond the pale, you're outside the bounds of what we consider safe or normal or good, you're on your own. I think I would say another rule of thumb would be, and let's see how he does here. So we have preposition, back as a preposition, Kodiak is a proper noun, fade is a verb, palisade is a noun, stare, in this case, is a noun, but it can be a verb, and then bear is a noun. So your rhyme words should have little in common apart from the fact that they rhyme. If all of your rhyme words are the same part of speech, we're going to hear it, it's going to feel dumb. We're just going to feel that you were rattling off rhymes. The more you can make them different parts of speech, sometimes different lengths, right? If you can get one, again, with the longer one coming second. Different root languages, right? If you can rhyme a Latinate word with an Anglo-Saxon word, that helps. The more it just feels as if it just spilled out of your mouth, the better. Yeah, please.
I'm just curious, why do you think palisade wouldn't be like a non-rhyme word that he would use in the poem?
It's a higher register. If you look at the words in the poem, Kodiak is a proper noun. Other than that, there's daylight, palisade, caution, resigned, bare-skinned, and husband. Those are the only polysyllabic words, right? So resigned is a little highfalutin, but palisade I think is a good register above the register of this poem. When you say register, does this mean anything to y'all?
We've talked about diction and word choice.
Sure. So there are many different ways to slice this, right? But we tend to, because our language is this hybrid of Latin by way of French and German by way of Anglo-Saxon, we have this sort of weird class system within our language. And most of the best writers in English use both of those influences and blend them really richly. But particularly in a certain context, sometimes we will adopt one over the other in order to convey a certain effect. Our swear words tend to be the Anglo-Saxon words for polite words that are Latinate, right? That's not always the case. Piss, for example, is actually French in origin, but a lot of the words we use that are rude words that you would not use in mixed company can mean a lot of different things these days, but you would not use with, around your roommate's parents. Those are just the Anglo-Saxon words, right? We have a feeling that some of our words are low class, and some of our words are aristocratic. And palisade tends to come from that higher register. Which again, it's not good or fair that we think that way. It's not good that we buy the Romans' opinion of the Anglo-Saxons as barbarians, right? That's not good, but it's true. And again, as with comedy, good poets are really interested in what effect it produces, not whether it should produce that effect. The other example I was just very quickly going to point to, I won't take this apart because I know we've got other stuff to do, but Killing the Calves, fascinating poem. Y'all read another poem by Robert Hayden that I think is also a 4/5 poem? Yeah. Unrhymed, not exactly metrical sonnet. This is a good one. He's such a weird poet. He just wrote so many different kinds of poems. He wrote poems in voices, he wrote poems about aliens, he wrote just like wacky, strange poems. He had an amazing variety. This is a really cool one. but it's one that I'm left kind of baffled by when I step back from it, because he starts by looking at a practice of certain cattle farmers when there was too much of slaughtering perfectly good cattle and destroying the bodies, burying them, in order to drive up the prices. It's the same reason Louis Vuitton burns their clothes at the end of the year rather than putting them on sale. And then he likens this, or he sort of sets against this image, the image of all the people not eating those cattle that were just slaughtered and put in the ground for no reason, right? Which is pretty poignant and striking. You think like, that's some injustice. And then he does this other thing, and I think he sets us up a little bit for this with the title "Killing the Calves," because I think it's hard to hear that, at least in a Western tradition, and not, to some extent, have the Old Testament come to mind. And of course the fact that for Jews, the whole practice of kosher slaughter is literally, if you look at Leviticus, literally what this means is that every time you eat meat as a Jew, you are literally eating a sacrifice to God. Because without the contract with God, you are not allowed to eat meat, if you read Leviticus, right? So that, this is going to be in our minds. He's setting us up, he's priming us for this to come to mind. And then this last stanza, he compares he of course he does the wonderful rhetorical trick of saying, there's no compare, I'm not going to compare this to the Holocaust, but the Holocaust, have you noticed? It's a lot like the Holocaust. And he ends with this, horrifying image of bodies, human bodies, being thrown into a pit. And he closes there, and I leave the poem thinking, God, this rips my heart out, but also like, wait, is it like the Holocaust? Like, that's not really a very good comparison. Like, it's an injustice and it's terrible, but that's not quite right. That doesn't quite make sense. But boy, he makes it feel, he makes it land. I mean, he delivers that blow. If I step back and think analytically and factually about it, I don't know what I think of it. But that's not what I'm concerned with, right? This is about poetry. This is about producing an effect. This is about getting a laugh, just like many, perhaps most jokes are not really fair. They can often get you to laugh. Anyway, so yeah, that's mostly my point was just with this. I just wanted to mostly give you some good poems to read, but also give you maybe another way to think about what's going on in a poem other than kind of what's the secret message or what's behind it. Just think about what it's doing to you in a certain order, right? It's priming you. It's setting you up to produce an effect. And often that's a sneaky effect. It's an unfair effect. It's a self-serving effect, but that's what's happening. Yeah, maybe I can stop there and I don't know what else needs to go on or what needs to happen.
Well, just any questions for Matthew, in terms of his process or any of the stuff in the Yezi essay. Matthew has read like everything, so the Donne and the Shakespeare and the Johnson, those are all ones that he'll have read as well. So I mean, if something that he said kind of sparked a note of interest or whatever, please don't hesitate to ask. As you guys collect your thoughts, I was curious about a couple things, and I wonder just first, and foremost, if you just talk a little bit. You're somebody who wears many hats, and I mean, I think like more so than when we were in college, that our students, they've got to make a decision about, a career, start paying back bills and so on. And, for folks who love to write, it can be a real balancing act. So, I mean, you're an assistant letter editor at Literary Matters, you're a podcast host, you're a father of two, you're working on a novel, and you're also composing poetry all the time. How do you do that?
And a couple others.
But it's exactly my point. It's not, I mean, I guess just say a few words about your evolution as a writer and kind of how. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that I have any good answers. Your dad is right that you're not going to make any money doing this. So that's true. If any of you, I know a lot of y'all are STEM majors, and Godspeed. If you are thinking about, for example, getting an MFA in writing, or that ever comes to mind, and I'm sure JP will second this. Don't go out of pocket. Don't go into debt. Get funding. If you can get funding and do it, but don't get it. Don't go into debt to get an arts degree, and don't after undergrad at least, but and don't expect that getting that degree is going to help you get a job at all, because it probably won't. It almost certainly won't. Doesn't mean don't get an MFA, because they can be great. I have to. But it has nothing to do with jobs. It's just a different world. My dad's advice was also pretty good, which was marry a doctor. Doesn't hurt. Yeah.
Everybody grabs their organizer.
Yeah, I mean, I think like the classic like writerly advice Rilke gives, and various other people have given versions of this, is, if you can imagine yourself doing anything else, do that. Only do this if not doing it would kill you. And I think that's pretty true. Flannery O'Connor said, I'm often asked if I think the university system stifles young writers, and I answer that I do not think it stifles enough of them. Which one understands where that feeling came from, and it's maybe only increased in the last 50 years or so. I would say you don't necessarily have to die if you're not going to write poetry, but just think really hard about what matters to you, and what this is like dumb like commencement speech advice, but you're going to need to think about what you want, obviously. You surely are already thinking about that, but you're also going to need to think about what you're willing to do without, right? Because what you want might be a big panorama, but some of those elements might end up being more important than others. And so I would think, think really hard about which ones of those you're willing to drop if you have to. Don't drop any if you don't have to, great, wonderful. But, think hard about what can be at the bottom of the list as well as what's at the top of the list. Other than that, fucking good luck. It's great. It's great. I'll also say, it is, when I read a poem, I'm so bitter and cynical about poetry. When I read a new poem and it's really good, I'm thrilled. It doesn't matter who wrote it. It doesn't matter where. You can't, as Sam Riviere says, you can't resent a genuinely wonderful poet. When I read a good writing, good short story. I read a slush pile for a magazine, so I read a lot of bad. But a couple of times I've pulled up documents where I thought this is going to be a chore, and it was fucking amazing, and that's great. And in both cases, I'd never heard of the person who wrote it. So that's it is delightful. It's wonderful, and it continues to be wonderful, and it's also a horrible chore. So in that way, it's not unlike having kids or any number of other things you do. But that's an old joke. That it's brutal and incredibly grueling, but also, of course, there clearly there are reasons people keep doing it, and it's not just because we don't know how to use condoms. So that's my non-advice advice.
I wanted to ask this Joshua Mehigan.
Oh yeah, Joshua Mehigan.
I don't know that I'd ever heard the name or read any, but it just seems like it's new. It's really good.
He's a poet I really admire. He's one of the handful of living, writing poets in the English language that I am extremely eager to follow. Anything new that comes out. He hasn't published a new poem in 6 years. No, I'm sorry, he hasn't published a new poem in 7 years. He has one new one I know coming out soon that I was eager to get my eyes on. This is from his second book. He publishes a book of poetry roughly every 10 years, which is about the right pace. It's about the right pace. A lot of poets publish a book of poems every 2 years. Fucking how? What are you doing? What is, I'll say, I have thus far not read a bunch of books of poems that all came out at 2-year increments and thought like, wow, these are all really good books. What I've often thought is, there's a good book among these, right? You should have just thrown out, T.S. Eliot was asked if he had advice for young writers, and he said, write less. And that is, that was partly him because he was so sparing. But I would say that's not really necessarily true, because you should be writing a lot. You should be reading more than you write, always. Always read more than you write. But you should be writing a lot, but just publish less. Just most of what you write, it's not even gonna be bad, it's just gonna be not good enough. And like, you shouldn't, y'all are probably a ways from like submitting things, but like, when you get to the point where you're gonna be sending things out to magazines and getting them rejected, which is how that works, unless you're Richard Goldberg, who literally never had a poem rejected. Son of a bitch. He's also a genius, but don't submit something unless you think it's great. If you think this is good enough to get published, no, it's not. If you think, holy shit, this is gonna blow their minds, that's when you send it out, and then it'll still get rejected. Yeah, Down in the Valley. So this is this little short poem. It is got 9 lines. Yeah, it's really good. Down in the Valley. It was her first time coming home from college. She headed downtown for a drink or two. Her girlfriend went home early. That was Christmas. Now, under sapling pine trees in the clearing, snowdrops are coming back to their old places. They had been gone a lifetime. Now they stand poised like a choir on the verge of singing. Nature is just. There's nothing left to fear. The worst thing that can happen happened here. What the hell is going on in this poem? Yeah? I remember reading it the first time, it just gave me a chill, and I didn't quite follow it. I had to go back again. This is, we said earlier that if you bother to say something, if you bother to say that something happened, it's presumably because it mattered. So this is a poem, I think, where he produces an effect by talking around something, by never quite naming it, but it makes it ache more for not ever quite being named. Yeah, sorry, what's your thought?
So this is just kind of going off of the reading to the comparison between jokes and poems and the recognition aspect. So it seems like within poetry, and I guess contrasted with comedy, where the punchline you want it to be immediate, you want it to be obvious, you want it to be accessible, that within poetry there's almost an added value if you don't get it at first. And I'm not sure if that's just like the pretentious side of poetry, but there seems like if it's inaccessible and you get it, then that's the real like zinger. Do you see any truth to that?
I see a lot of truth to that perception. I think that there are, and plenty of other people have made this observation, there are a lot of writers who deliberately make their writing obscure in order to make it seem smart, right? Because if you don't understand it, presumably they understand it, and so they must be smarter than you, right? And if you're writing in order to convince people you're smart, you picked the wrong line of business, right? Go be a doctor, and then you will be smarter than everybody, or no, that's not really true. I know a lot of doctors, they're not always that smart, but they're smarter than most. Yeah, I think that's a common perception. I think it is, and I think it feeds itself, right? People begin to believe that, both as readers and as writers, and so it snowballs. I think it's terrible. It's terrible, terrible, terrible. Now, what is true is that poems on the page, often there is something to get there on a second reading. If you get every single thing you need on the very first reading, then there may not be a whole lot going on there. But I certainly would not say make your poem more obscure in order to make it better. I think I read very quickly. I'm a very poor reader. I have to read a bunch of times and read slowly, and or I have to like slow myself down and go back and reread a line at a time and kind of work my way through. When I first read poems, I tend to just whip my eyes over them to see if they stir anything up. And usually my impression will be, I like, oh, wait, okay, I need to go back. Something happened here. And then I actually read it. But I'm not naturally a good reader. With this one, I think there is certainly a little bit of, he's showing off a little bit, but the showing off, I think, has less to do with just befuddling the reader than with conveying the sense of a tragedy without ever saying the words. And that's honestly something comedians do sometimes. It's like, often when you convey a joke, because it's old news, because probably what the joke is gonna be about is like sex or death or money, there aren't that many topics we're gonna touch, there aren't that many things that, we know most of the stories that there are about most people. Often the way you communicate it is through suggestion. So I think that's, there is some common ground there. I would say just very, very quickly, another great example of rhyme making something sound more true, right? The last two lines rhyme. It's not a rhyming poem. The last two lines rhyme, and that makes it snap shut. Yeats says a poem should come right with a click like a Chinese box. I think by Chinese box, what he meant was a lacquered wooden box with those, wooden flat surfaces. And this one certainly does that. Yes.
Hey, okay. So I had a question. You said sometimes the books that come out every 2 years, you think those aren't the best. So do you think when the publishers see them, they think that they're very obscure poems, so that's why they should be published? How do they even get through the publisher if you think they're not the strongest?
Yeah. There are different answers. Sometimes, yeah, I think that can be what's happening. I would just say that there's a very little relationship between merit and success in poetry. I think that's true, for all fields, there's no pure meritocracy on earth. But if you look at the different, chess and sports are more meritocratic. They're not perfect, and it's certainly the big difference with chess would be education availability and whatever, and free time and so forth. But those are, once you're doing them, at least it's relatively easy to tell who's better, right? With sports, with directly competitive fields, classical music also it tends to be it's not absolute, it's not perfect. My sister and her husband are both classical musicians. There's plenty of shenanigans there too, but it's more meritocratic. Poetry's way at this end. It's a free for all. I would say I published 2 books, or I published 1 book, and my second book's coming out this next month, theoretically. The editors, the publishers are taking this time. They both won prizes, and I think they're pretty good. I have no illusions that that's why they won the prizes. None. My first book, the guy who picked it told me why he picked it. He was drunk, and he thought I had a poem that had the word semen in it, and he thought that was funny. He said, I read all these manuscripts that were so boring, and then I got to yours, and it had the semen poem. I thought, who writes a poem about semen? Let's do this one. So, I'll take it.
Matthew Smith, winner of the Richard Wilbur Prize.
Right. That was a difference. He was, I think, at least probably sober at the time, and I think probably for other reasons. I don't. Again, I think they're pretty good. Here's the other advice. Here's the other big commencement speech advice. You may get what you want, and you might even deserve it. You almost certainly will not get what you want because you deserve it. So just take the win. And that, yeah. So I think there are lots of reasons books get published. Fuck if I know. Yeah.
There's I'm sorry.
No, you're talking.
The Abraham Lincoln quote: "Those people who love sausage and respect the law would do well not to watch either being made." And it's if you love books, don't even part the curtain.
Yeah.
Just to look at the weird politics that go into, and by politics I mean personal relationships and your buddies, your girlfriend's dad works at, Macmillan or something. It's it becomes a little nauseating. Books are
if you
still
have
good.
an unfair advantage, use it, just like it's all unfair advantage, just, thought, well,
Yeah.
please.
I just had a quick question, because earlier you were talking about how like in your own writing process, you're focusing on each line and you're not seeing like overall the bigger picture exactly just yet, if that's what you were saying. Like you think of
Sometimes,
like the line, then like how does like for something like this where it does close like a box really well like that, does that happen from line by line, or is it not like more of a bigger picture thing first? That makes sense.
I mean,
Good question.
my guess is JP would have a similar response, which is there's a little bit of both, and it tends to be kind of recursive. That you have an idea. I think here's like the real answer is like when I have had the idea for a poem and I've said this is the last line definitely. Almost always either that's not the last line or it's not good. If it is. So I think like Frost says you should always be writing into the dark. Someone else has compared it to driving a car on a dark highway where you can see ahead of yourself because your headlights, but only so far. So I think I also love structure and I write longer things too, and so I do sometimes like to have a sense of the whole, but it's good to leave some things undefined in order to, if you're not discovering anything,
Yeah.
then why bother? Because it's not going to be interesting. If it's not like gripping and compelling for you, it's certainly not going to be gripping and compelling for anybody else. But yeah, like most of the actual writing is like I don't know how to teach it. You just do it. And if you're doing it, then you're doing it. And God love. I just realized that incredibly rudely. I just have to text my students from my other class in teaching to let them know where we're gonna be at 6, just very quickly. I just realized I was supposed to send them a message or very quickly gonna do that. I'm so sorry. I just want them not to be confused about where we're heading on.
Well, there was something Carson said that, you triggered a teachable moment or something, whatever. But this poem Down in the Valley, it gave me the same feeling of reading Sunday Afternoons for the first time. And I think what they both have in common is like they're pretty simple. These sentences aren't, it's no verbal gymnastics, it's good, clear writing. I mean, even if I don't quite understand, if it might take me a second to get the punchline, but I'm there for the story up until then. It's just good, crisp writing, and for some reason it's, I was willing in this case to give it that second or third read, and it turned out to be rewarding. So.
Yeah, I guess like an amendment to the question I was asking is, I guess in poetry sometimes it's not just using obscure language and
Right.
obscure references or allusions or things to befuddle your reader, but sometimes like multiple meanings that take multiple reads and depth through making things kind of fuzzy at first. I don't know, like I rarely get what anyone's saying in the first read of a poem. So I don't know, like the punchline is delayed gratification, I think sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, the order in which you deliver the information is so crucial. It's one of the reasons, like, I think studying some poems in translation can be useful. Frost said, like, poetry is what gets lost in translation, and there's definitely truth to that. But, like, if you want to understand poem structure, read the Odes of Horace. And unless you know Latin, you'll be reading them in translation. But even in translation, what you can see is, what order does he put this information in? And that tends to produce he's setting up dominoes for you. I would also say, like, as far as deliberate obfuscation, again, like, if it works, you got away with it, but especially when you're really young, it's just so hard to write clearly. So if you are ever writing obscurely, make sure that you're doing it as a choice and not because you don't know how to do the other thing. So just like I'm still learning how to write clearly, and I feel like if you can really master that, that's an amazing accomplishment. I don't know. Yeah.
I just got a quick question on that note, like, How do you think you got better at writing more clearly? Do you think it's just through reading other people who are good at it?
I mean, don't speak too soon. I mean, I'm not sure I did. But yeah, I mean, reading and writing and reading aloud to other people in order to see if you can get an effect out of that. I mean, I guess practice is kind of the answer. I don't know. But again, I'm not, who knows whether I succeeded. Yeah, just really, really practice. Always, by the way, like always read what you're writing aloud to yourself, certainly. Like that can just make an enormous difference. Like, 'cause you can just hear when something sounds weird. Yeah.
I think just part of it for me, I was curious, like, we've been talking about, like, for example, you said, like, oh, it's only 8 lines, he's really good. Or, like, oh, like, say, like, use a 5-cent word and so, like, stuff like that. Is it trying to, like, bring it down to a plainer and simpler, more accessible level, the same thing as writing clearly?
Writing concisely is not the same thing as writing clearly, but I think they are related, and it's not that there aren't times to use higher register, it's not that there aren't times to go long, and there are even times to stall. There are even times to delay and to drag things out a little bit to produce an effect, to do something to your audience, right, to wind them up a little bit. But yeah, I just think like if certainly when you're starting out, if you can just challenge yourself to write clearly and concisely, that is a steep challenge. You will not be going easy on yourself.
Yeah. Thank you.
You had a question a little bit ago.
Yeah, kind of unrelated, but I was wondering for somebody that, I mean, I'm speaking about myself, but also I have some other people in the class, that doesn't want to write professionally.
Yeah.
What place do you think writing has in your life, like post-college? Or what place can you carve out for it?
Well, I mean, presumably you're gonna be writing text messages and emails all the fucking time, so, I mean, a lot, like, who was it, I was talking to recently, said like, well, everybody writes now. And there's truth to that, so you also are gonna, I had a friend, we had a friend in grad school who taught, maybe it was before you were there, who taught, a little 1-month class, a short-term class. I don't know if y'all have short-term here, or like a January term or something like that, but this is a Northern Scholar thing. But he taught a class on weddings, funerals, and best man speeches, or weddings, funerals, and what was the other one? Commencements or something. It was basically like speeches for amateurs. Times to give. By the way, another dumb commencement truism. Speak from the heart. Bullshit. No, don't speak from the heart. Michael Palmer says, the problem with first thought, best thought is that your first thought is usually a cliche. That's what usually comes to mind when you're just reaching for something.
Ain't that the way?
Yeah, oh yeah. I mean, it takes a while to make it seem original and natural and effortless and from the heart. Yeah, I mean, I guess my question to you is like, what role do you want it to have?
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's why I asked.
It can have not much of a role. I mean, my dad had a great career as a architect, and his emails are basically illiterate. I mean, I barely am able to decipher what he's trying to write. So it doesn't have to have a huge role, but also, I mean, anytime I've taught a writing class and really felt like I did a good job, I feel like it was almost a literature class. Like really reading, I mean, I feel like I'm still learning to read. Like reading is so hard, and so juicy and like rich that learning to write is partly about learning to read. And so if you spend a lot of time in writing classes and you enjoy them, but you don't really feel compelled to write much outside of that, presumably part of the relationship, part of the role writing is going to have in your life is your reading. Because you will be reading, when I read these, part of what I'm doing is I'm thinking like, well, what was going on here? How did you come up with this? Where were you stalling? Where were you fumbling? Where were you covering your tracks? And where did you have a stroke of genius? And that's partly just from experience, getting a sense of how to look at the thing. And also how to, like, I fear that now there are a lot of poets writing who are writing literally for college classrooms. Fuck those people, that's terrible, it's a terrible idea. You should not be writing for college classrooms, right? You should be writing, not that you shouldn't be writing for college students, you should be writing for readers to enjoy. And so, I mean, just having that perspective can really enrich your reading life. I mean, that's the other thing, like, it's, people write text messages, emails, but like most people don't write at length in a serious vocational way. Also, most adults after college don't read. They don't read, they read some websites and some newspaper articles or whatever, but they don't read books. Like most American adults after college don't read books. And that's the people who went to college. So yeah, I mean, just reading is, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, the reason I was like kind of thinking about it in part is because maybe this is just my own experience or experience at Duke, but there's a lot of emphasis in like the professional space about making sure you're always reading and learning, but I don't hear that same kind of emphasis for writing outside of the context of what you need to be writing, so emails, whatever, in a more creative way. And so that's kind of what I was trying to get at is, do you think that there's some kind of utility to that beyond doing it to, get published?
I mean, I don't know that there's any utility if you're doing it to get published either. Yeah, like Wilde said, like art is perfectly useless, he was sort of being a jerk when he said that. But I don't know. I think so Bishop said that for her, the value of writing was that it produced a self-forgetful, perfectly useless concentration. And that she lost herself in the pleasure of trying to figure out what she was making. And that was it for her. She didn't really care about anything else. And if you find it enriching, if you find that you're pursuing something you care about, and you're not publishing it, and your day job has nothing to do with that, but you thinking about it sometimes when you're riding on the train, and you come back to something and you want to mess with it, or you remember something you read, or you find yourself losing an hour or two just diving into a paragraph, and it never comes up in your daily life otherwise, you will be like most writers.